brace yourselves for a night of pure fire, where Nicolas Cage, Hollywood's wildest maverick, locks horns with Jimmy Kimmel in a showdown so intense, it ends with Cage storming off the stage. This isn't about a new film or a publicity stunt. It's about a personal passion twisted into a cruel joke, a line crossed, and a clash that leaves Kimmel reeling. What pushed Cage to walk away? Stick around to find out, but first, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. What's the most explosive talk show moment you've seen? Let's dive in. The spark ignites months earlier when Nicolas Cage, known for his bold roles and quirky obsessions, quietly donates a rare ancient artifact to a museum, a passion project he's kept low-key. The story leaks, and tabloids spin it into a narrative of Cage as a bizarre collector, hoarding oddities. Cage, used to the noise, shrugs it off, focusing on a new initiative to fund indie filmmakers, a cause tied to his love for unconventional art. When Kimmel's team invites him on the show, they pitch it as a chance to talk about this initiative, to celebrate his unique legacy. Cage, cautious but intrigued, agrees, sensing a rare opportunity. His agent warns him, "Kimmel's got a sharp edge," but Cage waves it off. "I've handled worse," he says, his voice calm, eccentric charm intact. The night of the taping, Cage strides onto the set of Jimmy Kimmel Live, his presence magnetic, a tailored suit paired with a quirky tie, his smile warm but wary. Kimmel greets him with a grin that's too bright, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Nicolas Cage, the man, the myth, the collector," Kimmel says, his tone playful but laced with a sting. Cage nods, settles into the guest chair, his posture relaxed but alert, ready to share his vision. The interview starts smoothly, Kimmel asking about Cage's indie film fund, the dreamers he's helping. Cage lights up, his voice passionate, weaving tales of raw, unfiltered cinema, his hands animated, eyes bright. But Kimmel's not here for passion. He shifts gears, his grin turning sly. "Nick, you're out there saving movies, but you're also what? Buying dinosaur skulls, ancient curses?" he says, his voice dripping with mockery. Cage's smile fades, his eyes narrowing, sensing the trap. Kimmel presses on, unrelenting. "I mean, we've all heard about your artifact obsession. Sounds like Indiana Jones gone wild," he says, his tone light but cutting, the words stinging. Cage's hands tense, his voice low, firm. "That's not the story, Jimmy. Let's talk about the work," he says, trying to redirect. But Kimmel's hooked his bait. He pulls up a screen behind them, flashing a tabloid headline, "Cage's Crazy Collection? Haunted Relics?" with a photoshopped image of Cage surrounded by glowing artifacts. "This is you, right, Nick?" "Quite the hobby," Kimmel says, his grin cruel, leaning back like he's scored. Cage's face hardens, his voice a quiet growl. "That's a distortion, Jimmy, and you know it. You don't get to mock what matters to me," he says, leaning forward, his intensity palpable. Kimmel shrugs, his eyes cold, unyielding. "Just having fun, Nick. People love the wacky Cage," he says, but his smirk betrays him, savoring the jab. Cage's eyes lock on Kimmel, his voice steady, dangerous. "Fun? You think my life's a joke? You're about to find out what's not funny." The segment cuts to commercial, Kimmel's grin faltering, Cage's stare unrelenting, the studio charged with the promise of a storm. Cage's hands grip the chair, his calm fraying while Kimmel, clutching his note cards, underestimates the wildfire he sparked. Nicolas Cage sits like a coiled spring, his eyes locked on Jimmy Kimmel as the commercial break begins, his hands gripping the chair, knuckles tight. Kimmel, his grin now a shaky mask, fumbles with his note cards, the air between them thick with unspoken rage. "You're making a mistake, Jimmy," Cage says, his voice low, steady, each word laced with a quiet fury. Kimmel leans back, forcing a chuckle, but his eyes flicker with unease. "Mistake? I'm just giving the people what "They want Nick," he says, his tone sharp, dismissive. The cameras blink back to life, signaling the end of the break. Kimmel straightens, his smirk returning but it's strained, his fingers twitching on the desk. "Welcome back. We're here with Nicolas Cage, getting a bit intense tonight," he says, his voice light but edged with malice. Cage doesn't shift, his posture rigid, his voice cutting through the studio. "Intense? You think mocking my life, my passions, is a game, Jimmy?" he says, leaning forward, his presence electric, commanding. Kimmel's eyes narrow, but he keeps up the act, gesturing to the screen where the tabloid headline, "Cage's Crazy Collection, Haunted Relics," still looms, the photoshopped image of Cage glowing mockingly. "Come on, Nick. It's just a story. People love the quirky Cage," he says, his tone mock-friendly, designed to sting. Cage's jaw clenches, his voice a controlled blaze. "Quirky? You're twisting my work, my heart, into your cheap caricature, and you think I'll just sit here?" Kimmel's grin twitches, his fingers tightening on his note cards. "Cheap? I'm just showing the real you, Nick. The guy chasing ghosts and weird statues," he says, leaning forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He pulls out a prop, a fake plastic skull with glowing eyes, and slides it toward Cage. "Got you a new toy for your collection," he says, chuckling, the gesture taunting. Cage doesn't touch it, his eyes burning into Kimmel, his voice low, searing. "You're pathetic, Jimmy. You think this junk defines me?" Cage shifts, his body taut, but he stays seated, his control razor-thin. "I came here to talk about something real, helping filmmakers, telling stories that matter," he says, his voice firm, trying to reclaim the narrative. "But you can't stand real, can you? You need your little jabs to feel big." Kimmel cuts him off, his tone openly hostile. "Big? Nick, I'm the one running this show. You're just the guy with the weird hobbies," he says, leaning forward, his smirk cruel, unyielding. Cage's eyes darken, his silence a weapon, his voice a quiet storm. "Weird? I've lived a life you couldn't dream of, Jimmy, and you're trying to shrink it into your sad little box," he says, each word a promise, not a threat. Kimmel's grin wavers, his fingers fumbling with the skull, a crack in his facade. "Big talk, Nick, but you're on my stage, my rules," he says, but his voice shakes, betraying his nerves. He reaches for another prop, a mock museum plaque labeled Cage's Oddities, hinting at another dig, but Cage's stare stops, him cold, unrelenting. Cage leans forward, his voice steady, lethal. "You think you can laugh at what I love? Turn my life into your circus? You're digging a hole, Jimmy," he says, his presence overwhelming, a man pushed to the edge but still in command. Kimmel's eyes dart, his smirk desperate now, his voice rising. "Circus? It's entertainment, Nick. Relax," he says, but the words ring hollow, his confidence fraying. Cage doesn't blink, his voice a quiet blade. "Entertainment? You're about to entertain the wrong man." The director signals another commercial break, the tension suffocating, Kimmel's hand frozen on the fake plaque, Cage's gaze a wall of fire. Kimmel's smirk is gone, his eyes betraying a flicker of doubt, while Cage sits, unmovable, his warning echoing, a wildfire ready to ignite. Nicolas Cage's gaze burns through Jimmy Kimmel, a silent vow of reckoning as the commercial break offers no escape. Kimmel's hand trembling on the mock museum plaque labeled Cage's Oddities. "You're out of tricks, Jimmy," Cage says, his voice low, steady, each word a spark in a powder keg. Kimmel sets the plaque down, his movements shaky, his eyes darting, but he forces a grin, thin and brittle. "Tricks? I'm just warming up, Nick," he says, his tone sharp, but the quiver in his voice betrays his faltering nerve. Kimmel leans back, trying to claw back control, his fingers tapping the desk. "You're acting like I invented this, Nick. Your whole weird vibe is public property, he says, his voice laced with mock innocence, pointing to the screen where the tabloid headline, "Cage's Crazy Collection, Haunted Relics?" flashes. Again, now with a mock poll. Is Cage a genius or a nut? Cage's jaw tightens, his voice a controlled inferno. Public property? You're twisting my soul, Jimmy. My choices into your pathetic sideshow, he says, each word deliberate. Heavy. Kimmel's grin falters, his eyes narrowing, his composure fraying. Soul? Come on, Nick. You're the guy buying cursed junk playing dress-up in B-movies, he snaps, his voice rising, cruel. He grabs another prop, a cheap plastic amulet, dangling it toward Cage. What's this? Your next Oscar-worthy relic? He says, his smirk returning, vicious but unsteady. Cage doesn't touch it, his eyes locked on Kimmel, his voice a quiet storm. You think you can mock what drives me, Jimmy? My work, my passions, they're bigger than your sad little stage. Cage leans forward, his presence electric, his voice steady, searing. I came here to talk about art, about giving dreamers a chance, but you can't handle art, he says, his words cutting deep. You need your cheap laughs, your fake props, because without them, you're empty. Kimmel's face reddens, his voice a snarl. Empty? I'm the one with the spotlight, Nick. I decide what's art here, he says, slamming the amulet. On the desk, the plastic cracking. The cameras roll back for the live segment. Kimmel's grin a grimace, his hands unsteady. All right, Nick, let's dial it back. Tell us about your film fund, he says, his tone forced, a desperate pivot. Cage cuts him off, his voice unrelenting. Dial it back? You turned my life into a punchline, Jimmy. There's no dialing that, he says, his eyes blazing, his body coiled but controlled. You wanted a reaction, you got one, now face it. Kimmel's eyes flash, his voice rising, frantic. Face it? You're the one losing it, Nick, ranting like a madman on my set, he says, pointing at Cage, his fingers shaking. You think you're above this? You're just a freak with a credit card. Cage's response is instant, his voice a quiet thunder. Freak? I've lived bolder than you'll ever dare, Jimmy. And you're trying to cage me in your lies, he says, each word a hammer, striking Kimmel's ego. Kimmel grabs a new prop, a mock movie poster titled Cage's Folly, waving it like evidence. You want to keep going, Nick? I've got more. Your whole career's a meme, he says, his voice a desperate hiss, his bluff growing wilder. Cage's eyes darken, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. You're bluffing, Jimmy, and even if you're not, you're too small to handle what's coming, he says, his calm more menacing than any outburst. Kimmel's hand freezes, the poster slipping, his eyes wide with a flicker of fear. Cage presses forward, his voice steady, lethal. You thought you could shame me, make my life a joke, but you misjudged, he says, each word measured, unyielding. I've taken risks, chased dreams, and you? You're just a bully with a microphone. Kimmel's jaw clenches, his voice shrill, unraveling. Bully? You're about to crash, Nick. This is my show, and I say when it's done, he says, but his words falter, his confidence shattered. He reaches for another note card, hinting at another jab, but Cage's stare stops him, a wall of fire. Cage leans back, his eyes never leaving Kimmel, his silence a blade. Your show's a trap, Jimmy, and you're the one caught, he says, his voice calm but final. Kimmel's fingers tremble, his eyes wild, his voice a weak retort. Caught? You're the one falling, Nick, right off my stage, he says, but his bravado is gone, his face pale. The director signals another break, the tension suffocating, Kimmel's hand clutching the poster, Cage's gaze unyielding, the clash poised to explode. Nicolas Cage's eyes bore into Jimmy Kimmel, a silent promise of reckoning, as the commercial break fails to quell the tension. Kimmel's hand trembling on the mock movie poster titled Cage's Folly. You're finished, Jimmy. Cage. says, his voice low, steady, each word a stone sinking Kimmel's crumbling facade. Kimmel drops the poster, his eyes wild, his voice a strained growl. Finished? You're the one done, Nick. You don't run things here, he says, but his shaking hands betray him, his bravado evaporating. Kimmel scrambles to recover, leaning forward, his fingers gripping the desk. You think you can scare me, Nick? I've got more. Stories that'll make this look tame, he says, his tone desperate, a reckless bluff. Cage's eyes narrow, his voice a controlled blaze. Stories? You're recycling lies about my life, my choices, because you've got nothing real, he says, each word deliberate, cutting deep. You're not a host, Jimmy. You're a vulture. Kimmel's face flushes, his voice rising, unhinged. Vulture? I'm the one with the stage, Nick. I make the rules, and you're breaking them, he snaps, grabbing the cracked plastic amulet, waving it like a weapon. This is you, Nick, a nutcase chasing ghosts, he says, his smirk returning, cruel, but shaky. Cage doesn't flinch, his voice steady, searing. Chasing ghosts? I chase truth, Jimmy, something you wouldn't recognize, he says, each word a blade, slashing Kimmel's ego. The cameras roll back for the live segment, Kimmel's grin a grimace, his hands unsteady. All right, Nick, let's move on. No need to drag this out, he says, his tone forced, a weak attempt to pivot. Cage cuts him off, his voice unrelenting. Drag it out? You mocked my soul, Jimmy. My art. There's no moving past that, he says, leaning closer, his presence a quiet. Storm, you wanted a fight? You got one, now deal with it. Kimmel's eyes flash, his voice a snarl. Fight? You're just a washed-up eccentric throwing a tantrum, he says, slamming the amulet on the desk, the crack widening. I can bury you, Nick, with one more jab. Cage's response is immediate, his voice a quiet thunder. Bury me? You're the one sinking, Jimmy. Look at you trembling, scared, because you know you went too far, he says, each word a nail in Kimmel's unraveling armor. Kimmel grabs another prop, a mock journal labeled Cage's Crazes, waving it frantically. You want to keep going, Nick? I've got pages. Your whole life's a freak show, he says, his voice a desperate growl, his bluff growing wilder. Cage's eyes darken, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. You're empty, Jimmy. No journal, no stories, just you, flailing because you can't stand me standing tall, he says, his calm a blade, slicing through Kimmel's defenses. Cage presses forward, his voice steady, lethal. You thought you could humiliate me, make my passions a punchline, but you forgot who I am, he says, each word measured, unyielding. I've lived fearless, taken risks you'd never dare. And you? You're just a coward with a desk. Kimmel's jaw clenches, his voice shrill, unraveling. Coward? You're about to crash, Nick, right here on my show, he says, but his words falter, his eyes glistening with panic, not power. Cage stands slowly, his presence towering, his voice a quiet inferno. Your show's a farce, Jimmy, and you're the fool, not me, he says, stepping toward the desk, his eyes locked on Kimmel. Kimmel lurches to his feet, his chair scraping, his voice frantic. Get out, Nick! You're done, he shouts, pointing to the exit, but his hand shakes, his authority gone. Cage doesn't move, his voice low, final. I'm not done, Jimmy, but you are. You crossed a line, and I'm calling it. The director signals another break, but the cameras keep rolling, capturing the chaos. Kimmel's face pale, his eyes wild, clutching the mock journal like a lifeline. Cage stands, unmovable, his gaze a vow of consequences. The studio silent except for the hum of the lights. The confrontation teetering on the edge of something unstoppable, explosive. Nicolas Cage stands like a force of nature, his eyes locked on Jimmy Kimmel, who clutches the mock journal labeled Cage's Crazes, his face ashen, his earlier bravado reduced to a trembling wreck. You've got no ground left, Jimmy, Cage says, his voice low, steady, each word a final judgment. Kimmel's hand shakes, the journal slipping, his voice a ragged hiss. No ground? This is my show, Nick. You're the one leaving, he says. But his words collapse, his eyes betraying a man unraveled, defeated. Cage steps closer, his presence a quiet inferno, his voice slicing through the studio's silence. Your show? It's a house of lies, Jimmy, built on mocking what you can't understand, he says, each word deliberate, heavy. Kimmel's jaw clenches, his voice rising, frantic. Lies? The world's laughing at your weirdness, Nick. I just turned up the volume, he snaps, waving the journal, but his hand falters. The prop useless, his bluff exposed. Cage's eyes darken, his voice a chilling whisper. You didn't amplify anything, Jimmy. You twisted my truth, and now you're choking on it. Kimmel slams the journal on the desk, the thud sharp, desperate. Choking? You're the one. Done, Nick. Ranting like a lunatic, he shouts, his voice cracking, unhinged. He grabs the cracked plastic amulet, holding it like a shield. This is you, Nick, a joke, and everyone sees it, he says, his eyes wild, his last gasp of defiance. Cage's response is immediate, his voice a quiet thunder. A joke? I've lived truer than you'll ever know, Jimmy. But you're too weak to face your own emptiness, he says, each word a blade, carving Kimmel's ego. Kimmel's face twists, his voice a snarl, but it's hollow, broken. Weak? I'm still here, Nick. You're just a shadow of your old self, he says, his hands shaking, the amulet slipping. Cage leans forward, his voice steady, lethal. A shadow? I'm more alive than you'll ever be, Jimmy. My passions burn brighter than your cheap shots, he says, his calm more menacing than any outburst. Kimmel's eyes glisten, not with tears but with rage, defeat. His breath ragged, his control obliterated. Cage straightens, his presence towering, his voice final. You wanted to shame me, Jimmy, but you shamed yourself, he says, stepping back, his eyes never leaving Kimmel. You crossed a line, and now the world sees you. Small, scared, finished. Kimmel opens his mouth, but no words come. His hands dropping, the amulet rolling off the desk, shattering on the floor. Cage turns, his stride deliberate, heading for the exit, but pauses, looking back. You got your circus, Jimmy, but I got my fire, he says, his voice a parting shot, leaving Kimmel slumped, silent. A man undone. Cage walks off, his head high, his steps unbroken, a man who's faced ridicule and emerged stronger. Kimmel sits, staring at the wreckage, the mock journal, the broken amulet, his own cruelty reflected back. The cameras catch every second, the feed cutting abruptly, leaving the world to dissect the fallout. And there you have it, folks. The night Nicolas Cage turned Jimmy Kimmel's mockery into a blaze of defiance, exposing a host's petty cruelty, and walking away untamed. What did you think of this clash? Was Kimmel's jab a fatal misstep, or did Cage's fire steal the show? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's get this debate roaring. And if you're not subscribed, hit that button now for more Hollywood battles that hit hard. Smash the bell, join the crew, and tell us who's the real fool here. Catch you in the next one.